Welcome to Praxis Journeys, where we explore the paths of today's most influential leaders in education and the real-world strategies they're using to drive lasting change. I'm Vinay Ganti. In each episode, I sit down with the people shaping the future of our schools to talk candidly about the big issues: teacher recruitment, leadership, innovation, school culture, policy, and more. Whether you're an educator, administrator, or advocate, you'll find fresh ideas and actionable insights to inform your own journey and help students thrive. Let's dive in.
Today's episode is a special one. We are joined today by Dr. James Lane, who recently joined ETS to lead not only our Praxis team, but across the full K-16 lifecycle. Couldn't be more excited to have him here. His arrival marks an inflection point for ETS and its commitment to innovation, development of mission-driven solutions. James shares his extensive experience in education, discussing his journey from teacher to educational leader. He emphasizes the critical role of assessment in driving school improvement and the urgent need to address the teacher shortage crisis. He highlights the challenges faced by superintendents, particularly in maintaining stability and managing budgets post-COVID. He advocates for innovative approaches to teacher preparation and the importance of early engagement in education careers. Looking ahead, James expresses excitement about leveraging AI and new assessment methods to enhance educational outcomes. We hope you enjoy this first conversation with James, which is sure not to be our last together. James, thanks again for your time today. I'd love to just start off with letting you say a little bit about yourself to our audience and let them know who you are.
Yeah. Thanks, Vinay. I'm excited to be with you today. I lead the K-16 initiatives at ETS, and that includes our work in Skills for the Future and Compass and Mastery Transcript Consortium, California Student Assessments, and then, of course, the Praxis team. Super excited to be here at ETS. I've been an educator my whole career, led DC-based nonprofit, PDK International, where we focused primarily on grow your own teacher programs, which was inspiring work. I led at the federal level, where I had an opportunity to be at the U.S. Department of Education and lead elementary and secondary education efforts. I was a state chief, or state superintendent, as we call it, in Virginia, a district superintendent, a principal, a teacher, and just have a huge passion for making a difference in kids' lives. And every step of my journey has been about growing impact. And this opportunity at ETS has been uniquely amazing, as it allows me to think about assessment and how we can innovate the world of assessment.
No, we're very excited to have you here. I'm very excited to have you as my boss, and so welcome to ETS. And let's start there. What inspired you to join ETS? Maybe go a little deeper there, but also why now? What about the moment today is really sort of makes you feel like this is the place for you?
Yeah, so I've always been really interested in education measurement, assessment, and how we can know more about what we do in schools to drive our school improvement efforts. And I think that this time in education is uniquely poised to have a huge impact on assessment. As you know, the federal government is thinking about ways to shift more responsibility from the federal level to the state level. And without getting into politics or who agrees with that or whatever, let's just assume for a second that that's moving forward. Well, states are going to have a lot more influence on the future of assessment, and whether that's through waivers with the federal government or new dollars that may shift to the state level, I think that states are poised to really think about innovating in this space and to be at one of the largest assessment companies in the world, and already running one of the larger assessment profiles with the work that we won in California a few years ago, has me thinking that this next phase for education is rife to innovate. I'm cautiously optimistic about that, because at the same time, we've seen student performance declining on NAEP and other factors in states. And so I feel like we have a responsibility. And what's unique about ETS with the research backbone and being a nonprofit is that we have the ability to really help states think about the best ways to measure students while holding the line on ensuring that we're keeping high standards for kids. Because what I've seen throughout my career is when we've lowered standards, student performance decline. When we raise standards, student performance tends to increase. Now, there's a lot behind that, but we've got to make sure that we're still building that solid foundation and the basics of reading and math at the same time of thinking about new ways to assess with the tools that are happening with AI and the new flexibilities that states will have. And I think that this 3 to 4 year period is going to be driving probably how we think a lot about this work for the next decade or maybe even 2 decades. So that's why I came to ETS, and that's why I came now. I really want to be on the forefront of making a difference to make sure that we are improving students' lives. It's in our mission, right? We're about human potential. Like, education is all about improving human potential, and you start that with kids in their education.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think, the role of assessment, and I think a lot of the conversations around what is possible with assessments, these aren't necessarily new conversations. I feel like we revisit them every decade or so. But I think what's interesting this time around is we might finally have the technology and the tools at our disposal to actually change the game, right? With the advent of AI, with the sort of rise in the sophistication of how simulations and other things can work, we can actually maybe scale different, more sophisticated ways of assessing people beyond just like a multiple choice exam. And so I think that's super exciting. I think that's what's motivating a lot of us to have come to ETS. Many of us on the Praxis team are relatively new to ETS as well. So I think we all share in your energy and excitement of the ability to do something really groundbreaking here in the future. You mentioned, you were a state superintendent and also you worked in the Biden administration and you were CEO at PDK, really sort of helping them refocus and double down on educators rising. As you think back on your career, like going back to the Steve Jobs quote, you can only sort of like connect the dots in hindsight. Do you see some sort of through line around sort of your career so far, like the things that really have motivated you or really sort of gotten you going professional standpoint?
Yeah, there are a couple through lines there. I mean, especially when you include my time leading Educators Rising as part of being CEO of PDK. The biggest pain point in education is the teacher shortage. And it's another reason that I came to ETS, honestly, is, we have huge influence over teacher supply and pipeline through our Praxis work. And as a state superintendent, every year I was worried about whether my districts had the supply of teachers necessary to have a successful year. And when I started my career, as an administrator anyways, in the mid 2000s, I can remember getting 50 applicants for every teaching job. And elementary, I mean, it might have been hundreds of applicants for every teaching job. It wasn't that long. I mean, like 5 or 10 years later, we would get no applicants for a whole host of jobs. And then elementary, which was usually packed with applicants, I would get like 1 or 2 applicants as the superintendent in Middlesex. And so then it became like a competition game around, the factors of what we could offer to encourage people to come to our community versus our neighboring communities. And the shortage continued to get worse as time went on. And I went more into, larger district superintendencies and the state superintendency. And it's the number one issue that I think is necessary to make a difference in our schools. We're not going to have significantly better schools without investing in teachers and frankly, principals who hire and train and develop teachers. And ultimately, it's an economic issue, right? We know, there was a Forbes article I quote from time to time, and it said something along the lines of, it's not as though there are not enough humans to teach. It's that we're not incentivizing enough humans to choose the field. And so, the pay issues are significant. We're going to have to continue to address that. But then there are other factors where, that's largely out of most of our control on a day-to-day basis. Policymakers have to make those decisions. And, I've been in places where policymakers really tried to go after this. And you might see some states in recent years doing 5 and 10% increases for teachers. But what we've learned is that's not even close to the tipping point. The tipping point to really get more people energized about teaching is significantly higher than the increases that we've been talking about. And you've seen that work in other fields. And so we're going to have to put some attention to that. But so I spend my time less thinking about that, though I worry about it all the time, and more thinking on, well, what are the other factors that we can put in place to improve teacher quality, improve teacher supply? And, we know that the assessments like Praxis have a huge role in addressing teacher quality, at least initial teacher quality. We know that our principal licensure assessments and things like that have a huge role in addressing teacher quality by addressing principal quality. But this notion of new and more flexible pathways into the classroom and encouraging more people to get in the field, and how we can honor and respect teachers and remove burdensome requirements on a day-to-day basis and make sure they have solid planning. All of these things are super important in places where, my jobs have carried a clear through line. As state superintendent, I tried to remove the burdens on teachers, certainly did that as a district superintendent while protecting their instructional time. When I got to PDK and Educators Rising specifically, we were thinking about how we could start as early as middle school and high school to energize more people to get into the field. And then when I got into federal service, we opened up, the flexibility to then have registered teaching apprenticeships for the first time. And so that through line is a constant piece that I'm thinking about. And now here at Praxis, and Vinay, of course, you lead this work. You can talk way about this more than me. We're building out a whole strategy that, at least internally, we call Praxis Recruit, where, we're thinking about, okay, how can we use our global brand experience to bring international teachers into the mix? And how can we be a part of the apprenticeship movement and helping people upskill from being a paraprofessional to a teacher? How can we think about new and more innovative ways to have teachers show their content knowledge? Are there new assessments we should be thinking about to ensure that teachers are ready for the pedagogy that it needs, or classroom management skills, so that we can better predict who's going to be retained in 3 to 5 years? So these are the types of things that I'm thinking about all the time. But that through line around the shortage and supply and quality, that has been everywhere that I've been throughout my career.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably no coincidence that when it sort of speaks to how challenging the role of a superintendent has become, and obviously that's sort of one of the major audiences that we want to reach with these conversations that we're having on Praxis Journeys. And as somebody who's sort of sat in that seat, like what sort of tips or lessons can you sort of share back to that community right now, given how challenging that role could be? I mean, I think one of the things you mentioned around sort of how like just the job applications being drying up for high quality teachers, just like not being there. But what else? But what other sort of areas are you seeing where superintendents potentially are struggling, and potentially are there any like bright spots from your time that you're like particularly proud of that you sort of helped overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah. One of the biggest challenges in the superintendency right now has been the significant amount of turnover that's happening for a variety of reasons. And I'll save that for today. For probably the most serious time in the history of the superintendency, we've got a lot more novice superintendents than we've seen in many, many years. And that filters on more novice principals and more turnover in teachers, some of the things we've already talked about. And so one of the things that I notice as a leader that likes to guide and mentor superintendents is it's going to be really important that we find a way to ensure that innovations that happen in a district are certainly led by the superintendents that's there. They're setting the shared vision for the community and all that. But if they build up something really great, we got to find ways to sustain that after they retire, after they go to the next district, after they take the next job, or whatever happens to make that change in their career. And I've seen over and over again as a state superintendent, as a district superintendent, districts get on this amazing trajectory with a leader, and then it stops when the new leader comes. They want to bring in their own thing, and then they're almost starting over at square one. And there's usually a period of actually tougher results because of that shift and that change. And so when I talk to school boards all the time, the superintendent may move on to another job. They may retire. They may, have to leave the school district for whatever reason. But how can you as a board make sure that you're setting forward a strategic plan that, regardless of who's principal at your middle school or who is in any seat in your district, is moving the district forward in a way that's going to really make a difference for kids. And as your new CEO or superintendent comes in, sure, you want them to enhance and update that vision and that strategic plan. But the core focus areas of the community are widely known from all of the parents to the teachers, principals, and of course, the superintendent. And so the other big challenge that I'm seeing for superintendents is this is a uniquely difficult budget time. In the role that I had in the federal government, we put out guidance on this over and over again. Like, make sure that you're prepared for this massive infusion of COVID relief dollars. There were 3 different types of COVID relief. And, the last set just expired last year. And make sure that you're setting your school and district up for sustainability when those dollars are gone. And the idea of those dollars at the beginning was to infuse a lot of money into high dosage tutoring and academic recovery efforts and get kids right back to where they were pre-COVID. Then the dollars go away, those resources and those supports won't be necessary, and we'd move on. And what we found, and if you've seen the Harvard studies, I quote Tom Kane on this all the time, is most districts were doing that tutoring and academic recovery work, don't get me wrong. They just weren't doing it at the magnitude necessary for kids to recover fast enough. Tom Kane at Harvard was suggesting something like 100 hours a year at the time of tutoring, and we were seeing like 30 hours a year, which amounts to, in a 36-week school year, 9 weeks, 1 hour a week, and it really needed to be about 3 hours a week. And so guess what? Now, 4 or 5 years later, we're still not caught up to where we were. Now the dollars are gone. So the superintendents still have the pressure to bring scores back because they didn't do it fast enough when the dollars were there. And now they're strapped for dollars to be able to get the things done that they need to do to make a difference in the district. So that's the biggest second piece of advice I would give Soups is make sure you're taking a really deep dive in your budget. There's a saying in education, like I can look at your budget and tell you what your priorities are. I don't need to look at your strategic plan. Well, hopefully, as superintendents, you're thinking about what's in that strategic plan and you're investing those dollars directly to it. And your community can clearly see the strategy in writing and in resources. Now, in terms of some of the things I'm proud of, I took over a large school district here in Virginia, who for the first time had schools not accredited when I took the job. And, 1 year later, we were able to get all of those schools accredited again. When I took over as superintendent in another district, they had a school with pass rates in the 50s in some subject areas, and we were able to get those, into the 90s and above. And that school district is still one of the top districts in its region. And so anytime I talk about what I'm proud of, I never get into the political initiatives or the big budget wins or all these things that sometimes make the news. For me, we're only winning when our kids are achieving and we're getting them on to a great life. And so I always like to highlight those districts that took underperforming schools to a status where they're doing really well, because when I look back on my career, those are the moments in time that matter the most to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I would echo sort of what you just said. I think it's worth repeating, which is, having a strategic plan, but making sure that you're right sizing your budget and your resources to actually deliver on those strategic priorities, right? Like, and I think with the disappearing of ESSER funds, we are entering into a world where focus and you can't do it all is going to become sort of the new normal, right? And so you really are going to have to be laser focused on, here are the 2 or 3 things that I am really committed to achieving this year, and here's how I'm going to spend to get those results. What we're seeing on our side is our increasingly superintendents are looking at, in this restricted environment from a funding standpoint, or back to normal environment from a funding standpoint. One of the things that we are seeing that is promising is an increasing awareness of the need to view teachers more as a pathway or pipeline, as opposed to just getting them in the door, but really sort of worrying about, once we have them in the door, how do we keep them around? How do we retain them? How do we upskill them? And we're hopeful that mindset continues and persists into spending patterns going into the academic year. One thing that you mentioned, I think is super interesting, is you sort of made sure to highlight the importance of the leaders of the building as well, both at the principal level and also at the superintendent level, and that a lot of superintendents. I imagine a lot of principals these days are also probably relatively young or inexperienced in there. If you were a board or if you're a community right now, how do we support these relatively novice leaders? Because that seems to be its own sort of challenge, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I always thought about was um, I never get concerned when a principal takes a promotion or a leader went to a what they perceived to be a professional growth opportunity that was bigger and better for their career. That was, to me, that was a celebration of our work together, that I was able to help them grow to that point in their career. And certainly always celebrated the numerous folks that worked for me over the years that became superintendents. And, I've got dozens of those in what they jokingly refer to as the Lane family tree. So, I think that the days of where most of your principals are going to be 33-year veterans and have been in that building for 10 years is becoming more and more rare. I still encourage folks to do that if they can, because what we know is that stability in those roles makes a huge difference. But in the absence of stability, we've got to make sure that we're building out pipelines so that the next person up is always ready to go. I hate to use a football metaphor, but having played a little bit of football in my day, the quarterback gets hurt, backup still got to take us to the Super Bowl, right? And so I think about that all of the time. And so I invested a ton of dollars across all of my districts in not only the teacher recruiting and pipeline work. I mean, we had principal pipeline work, and in Virginia, there's an amazing program that out of UVA that they call Scope. I always tried to find those, you know, top quality APs or teachers that I thought were going to become APs or principals one day. And I had them in those programs, and we ran new cohorts of that program across the districts that participated in that with UVA. Year in, year out. I also invested a lot of dollars in, tuition reimbursement so we could get people advanced degrees so that they could go into those roles. But I built a ton of cohorts, and, I had partnerships throughout my career with Virginia Commonwealth where they would come on site and teach cohorts of future principals. And eventually, in Chesterfield especially, we had doctoral cohorts going on all the time. And if you look across the principalship and the central offices in Chesterfield, most of the individuals in those roles now have doctorates because of the way we invested in that intentionally. And we just felt like that was ongoing professional development. So much professional development happens in schools in like the 2 weeks before school starts, because you're so busy during the school year, it's hard to find time with folks to do job embedded and ongoing professional development. And there just aren't enough coaches and mentors in the way we staff schools for that type of job embedded work. So we really had to rely on EPPs and university partners to do that training. And so, I just think that's essential. You need to be identifying talent early in your teachers and in your principals. You need to be getting them into situations where they can grow. And then frankly, if there were opportunities in my school district where they could, try out administration by helping with little things from lunch duty to bus duty to whatever, not as a requirement for teachers, because I don't want to take from their planning time. But if they want their principal to see them as the next leader, they could volunteer to do those things. Again, not all the time, but from time to time. So, and then frankly, and as a superintendent, I just personally found ways to tap people and, mentor them myself. And, when I would go by the school, I'd ask them how their career journey was going. And it's, it's a small thing, but it's a big deal to people to know that the senior leaders in the district are thinking about them and where they can go. And so, I always have a feeling that the most important hire that I made as a district superintendent were my principals. And it was a pretty rigorous process to become a principal for me. You had to go through panels of your teachers, panels with parents, panels with central office, and then eventually ending with me. And we would do scenario-based work. I just felt like the more we could do to help people before they got that moment, by the time they stepped into the building, we'd have them ready. But I will say, and we're thinking about this some here at ETS, this whole world of what's going to happen with AI and simulation, and we're going to be developing products around this at ETS in the future, I believe, is huge. And that where teachers will actually get the chance to practice in a simulated live environment principles as well with scenarios, I think we're going to be able to help people be ready for that moment. Because I used to say that you'll never know if you're going to be a great teacher until you actually teach. You'll never know if you're going to be a great principal until you're actually leading a group of teachers. Maybe we won't be able to say that in the future if we can use these new tools to help people make a decision around the future of their career.
Yeah, I think that sort of discovering and try before you buy sort of opportunities, they're rare today, but if we could sort of scale and make those more readily available, that could be definitely be a game changer. I mean, I think that it's one of the things you said, or many things you said, it got me thinking was, maybe one approach here is, the rest of the economy has sort of accepted the fact that no one stays in the same job for more than 3 to 4 years. And we're like building an economy that sort of assumes that. And maybe in K-12, like it's time for us to sort of acknowledge that like there is going to be more revolving door at the teaching, principal, and school and district leadership levels. And that's okay if you build out the infrastructure to allow for succession planning and transition of leadership and other things where it isn't so dependent on a persona or a single charismatic leader sort of driving that district forward, right? It makes me think a lot about, a lot of the great work that's coming out of ASU around the team teaching model and creating more flexible, like, ways for people to get into the workforce. But there's probably a similar conversation around what does flexible working and more of a collaborative team teaching model look like at the leadership level, at the school building, and even at the district level. Maybe the concept of co-principals or co-superintendents and other things like that, right? Or staggering them. So you have like sort of like, that there's probably a lot of interesting conversations here that as an ecosystem, we just haven't had the bandwidth to really think about, but now is the time to sort of ask these questions. What sort of questions are you looking? I mean, actually, before I go there, you've sort of done every stage of like the educator life cycle, both as a teacher yourself, but then, as an administrator, you sort of closely work alongside with parapros, teachers, everyone in the building. And also then at your time at PDK, the whole idea is trying to engage high school students to become interested in the profession of teaching. That must have been a really interesting experience. Do you mind sharing a little bit more about what EdRising does and your time there, and maybe talk a little bit about the national conferences and things like that? I got to go to one of them this year. Pretty amazing to see these students so committed at such a young age.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, one of my favorite programs in the nation. So most people know what education is, right? These are the programs where students take courses to learn about a much more nuanced and specific field. It might be everything from mechatronics to agriculture to marketing or something like that. Well, we had a belief at PDK and at Rising when I was there that there should be comparable programs that are teaching people about education in our high schools as well. And so we built out a full CTE program that, essentially trained the next generation of teachers beginning in high school on how to become a teacher. Probably the most important piece is we didn't actually expect every person that went in that program to become a teacher. But so we also use the program as a way to teach people about how education actually works and what does your principal do versus the superintendent versus the school board, and how does the system work, and how does the state influence policy. And so we were, it had a little bit of a civics and a how things work overtone to it as well. But at the core of the program, it really was giving kids an experience in an educational environment to see if they saw that as an opportunity for their future. And, we felt like we had the best in class version of that anywhere in the nation. There are a number of organizations that do that. And what made Educators Rising unique was, in addition to the curriculum and the daily content that they would get in class, they had a career and technical student organization that paired with it to basically train students up on these skills in the after school space or in internships and work-based learning experiences. And some of the kids would tutor as part of that program, or others would, volunteer or even work in an early childhood center. And we just wanted kids to get as many experiences as possible earlier so they could make a better decision about whether that's something they wanted to do forever. And part of our thinking was, if you got those experiences and loved it, great. Maybe you'd major in college. If you got into those experiences and hated it, we wouldn't have some of the retention issues that we have. And we were hoping that the whole model would retain more teachers over time. And then we learned another thing in all of that, and that is we did some studies and we found that over 60% of teachers end up teaching within 20 miles of where they went to high school. And I didn't know that stat before I got into that work. And I can remember as a superintendent, we would go to Pennsylvania. I was, of course, in Virginia. We go to Pennsylvania recruiting. We go to Michigan recruiting. We go to all these other places trying to find teachers to encourage to come to our, little district in Virginia. And at the end of the day, your best opportunity to recruit is right in your home community. And so we intentionally built the program as what we call a high school grow your own program, where our teacher leaders, we were encouraging them to go around the high school and look for kids that have some acumen in working with students or teaching or, modeling peer behaviors or whatever it may be, just anything that you think might have them thinking that teaching could be a great career. And, try it out. Join the club, join the class, whatever piece of it you want to. And let's just get more people thinking about education. And what we found is that, in the data that we had there, more kids were likely to major in college when they were part of a high school grow your own program. The teachers in the program, with like 95 to 100% of teachers in the program believe that their kids were better prepared to be a teacher because they went through the program. And then, we partnered here with the Praxis team and did some assessments of kids. And guess what we found out is kids were more likely to pass Praxis exams if they had been through the program. And, we'll certainly continue to validate that in our research efforts. That was a small sample at the time, but everything about career pipelines has to start with interest in middle school, experiences in high school, in-depth training through college, and then, of course, they get into the field and they're successful. And if we think we're going to start convincing is probably the wrong word, we think we're going to start seeing a lot of people choose education as a career in their third year of college, we're going to continue to have a shortage. I mean, we've got to get them thinking about it earlier, understanding how the pay and incentives work and all of those type of factors. And so I still am a huge believer that if we're going to eliminate the teacher shortage, there are a number of strategies. Always pay first. You'll always hear me say that. But I think that getting kids to think about education as a career in high school is important. Now, I'll add one more piece to that, and that is I spent a lot of time, both as a superintendent and as the CEO that led this Ed Rising work, thinking about how I could make sure that people knew that almost any job that you want to do can be done in your local government. You want to be a nurse? We've got nurses in schools. You want to be a doctor? We've got doctors. You want to coach? We got coaches, right? I mean, sports, and I hear about famous athletes becoming high school coaches all the time. I'm just so inspired by that. You want to be a lawyer? We got plenty of lawyers in our schools. You want to work in engineering or architecture? We're building schools all the time. There's just so many different things that you can do working for your local government and your local school system. We just wanted to make sure that folks knew that all these other dreams that you have, you can work in your community and do those, and teaching can be a pathway into any of those opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something really compelling about a work-based learning model where like the students actually become part of the building's employee base, right? Like while they're even in school type of, like you can imagine like taking that to a logical extreme. So I guess I'll wrap up with one last question and just give you an opportunity. Looking ahead now, you're here. We're like I said, we're all very excited to have you here. Where do you find yourself getting most excited about for the next year or two as you sort of are driving the strategy and the vision for not only Praxis but K-16 as a whole?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the Praxis work. We're beginning to engage in some incredible enhancements to how we think about teacher quality, teacher content knowledge, and high leverage teaching practices. And it's the one of the main reasons that I really wanted to be at ETS and do assessment work is because we do have this research backbone. And our research team has found 8 high leverage practices that if we can develop those skills in future teacher or even current teachers, that we know that we're going to have stronger outcomes with students. So now we're beginning on the Praxis team to take those high leverage practices and think about ways that we can embed them into our assessments so we can give future hiring folks in school districts and states more tools to think about how they can improve the quality of their teachers. And we're doing it in a way that I hope over time is going to be more efficient using AI simulations and other ways of gaining information about what our teachers know and now can be able to do. I still feel like licensure assessments are super important. I feel like we have a responsibility and parents have a right to know that teachers know the content that they're teaching. But I think that we can kind of pivot to this thinking around, okay, what are these other attributes that are especially important to the success of a teacher? And then as the K-16 leader here at ETS, we're developing out a whole host of work around assessing student skills. And we've always been able to pretty good, in a good way, to hone in on, kids' content knowledge and end of course tests and all that. We've gotten really great at that as a field. What I would love to know is, are we actually developing the skills in kids that are going to help them be more successful in the workforce and have more gainful employment and all of these type of things? And we're building solutions not only in the K-12 space, but in the higher ed space and workforce space to think about that. And then finally, I talked about this earlier, so I probably won't go as lengthy here, but we lead a lot of work in kind of the broader end of year student assessment. I hope that we don't have it just be end of year anymore. I hope it becomes more formative over time in our work. Of course, we'll follow what our states are and our clients are asking for, but I hope that we can think about ways to do student assessment so we can learn more about our students while making sure, again, as I said earlier, that we're shoring up those essential skills of reading and math that kids need to be successful in our future economy.
Awesome. Well, James, thanks again for your time today. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and looking forward to having you on the show again soon. Ideally, maybe to talk a little bit more about some of the political issues and other topics that, I know are close or near and dear to your heart. And yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, thanks, Vinay. Always glad to talk with you.
Sure.
Well, thanks for listening to Praxis Journeys. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you know someone who'd find this conversation helpful, feel free to share it with them. I'm Vinay Ganti, and until next time, keep learning, keep leading, and keep working toward the kind of change our students deserve.